And we're back with our panel of distinguished authors. They get a chance to turn the tables here. Kitty, your question, and who would it be to?
To Dr. Rice, absolutely. I'm in the middle of reading your book, and I have to tell you, one of the parts that really rang home with me is when you were at the conference for the Middle East and you set your speech aside and said, look, I know what it feels like to be Palestinian and be told that you cannot walk down the highway because of who you are. At the same time, I understand what it feels like to be an Israeli mother and wonder if your house is going to be bombed and your children will be killed. And I thought that was just, it was just so honest of you to expose yourself that way. And my question for you is a question that I receive all the time, and that is, are things better today among African Americans and whites than they were? And I'm asked that question, and I always feel like that's kind of like, you know, Walter pinching Michael, and someone asking me, what does that feel like? But you still have family in Birmingham. What do you think about that?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'm asked it all the time, too. And I always say that, first of all, we're never going to erase race as a factor in American life. It is a birth defect with which this country was born out of slavery. We're never really going to be race blind. But we have gotten to a place that race is not the limiting factor that it once was. I don't think that we necessarily look at somebody who's of a different color now and say, oh, I know what they are capable of. We have a black president. We've had 2 black secretaries of state. We have black CEOs. Obviously, African Americans are pushing way into territories that probably my grandparents would never have thought possible. But again, I think it goes back to whether or not race and class, that is race and poverty, is not becoming even more of a constraint, because with the failing public schools, I worry that the way that my grandparents got out of poverty, the way that my parents became educated, is just not going to be there for a whole bunch of kids. And I do think that race and poverty is still a terrible witch's brew.
All right. Michael Lewis, do you have a question for the panel?
Yes, but I'd like to, can I ask everybody one question? It's a quick question, I'd like a quick answer, and that is, everybody on this panel grew up in the South and left. Kitty's come back, but everybody's had this experience of leaving the South. Now, what I wonder, I'd love to hear what the other 3 panelists think would have happened to their lives had they never left where they grew up. What would you have become?
I would answer first and just say I wouldn't have gotten to go to work at CBS. I mean, the reason I came to Washington is because I was offered a job and I needed the money.
So what would you have been? What would you have been if you'd stayed home?
I have no idea. I suppose I would have worked at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, which is where I worked before I came north. Walter?
Well, you know, Mike, I was down in New Orleans all last week, and you used to say that 100 years ago, New Orleans was a very entrepreneurial culture, and after the storm, perhaps we could get that back. I was surprised at how vibrant and entrepreneurial New Orleans now is. If I had stayed there, obviously I would have been a writer and a journalist. I worked at the Picayune. I would have maybe even tried to write fiction like Kathryn did, but wouldn't have been as successful doing it, I'm
What
sure.
about you, Dr. Rice?
I would have been a school teacher, like all of my relatives. Not a bad profession, but I think I would have been a teacher in the Birmingham Public Schools.
Mm-hmm. Kitty?
I would probably still be living in Jackson, Mississippi, wondering why I got kicked out of the junior league.
Condi Rice, would you like to ask the question?
I'd like to ask a question of my friend Walter. Walter, you've done biographies about people who you couldn't interview, like Einstein and Ben Franklin, and then this wonderful biography of Steve Jobs. I'm always struck by whether people could have been something else. We tend to think of these great figures as destined to do what they did. Is there anything else that you could have imagined Steve Jobs doing other than what he did?
You know, he talked about dropping out of college and going into the intersection of art and technology, which is what he did. But he said he almost thought of going east, and he tried to do that counterfactual. What would I have been if I had gone into a different field? I think he would have, he had 2 sides to him, the artistic side and the geeky tech side. I think he would have been more of an artist if he had gone east.
All right, Walter, I'm sorry we don't have time
That's all
for your
right.
question. We'll have you next time. But I think any of you could now be the moderators of Face the Nation. You asked very good questions. I want to thank all of you for being with us today.